One of the largest trends in private equity in 2023 is the rise of GP-led secondaries. So we went to Europe to interview Joaquin Ruiz, the head of secondaries at the European Investment Fund, the EIF, the largest investor of private equity and venture capital funds in Europe. Now, before I continue, just to throw in a disclaimer, the views expressed in this video do not necessarily reflect the views of the EIF, and the mere appearance of EIF employees in this video does not constitute an endorsement by EIF or its affiliates of the video content. In this video, we will dive deep into GP-led secondaries. We will start by giving a review of LP-led and GP-led secondaries. Then we will go over the motivations for GP-led secondaries. Then we'll talk about GP-led secondaries and the EIF. And we'll end the video with a final thought. So let's get started with the review of LP-led and GP-led secondaries. A typical private equity fund is 10 years in length, but investors can shorten the duration of a private equity fund through a private equity secondary transaction. Let me explain how this works. In a private equity fund, LPs or limited partners are the investors in the private equity fund, and the GP or general partner is the private equity firm in the private equity fund. At the beginning of the fund, LPs commit capital to the private equity fund for the entire term. But in the event an LP wants to sell its interest in the private equity fund before the term is complete, the LP may sell its interest in the private equity fund to another LP in what is called a private equity secondary transaction. That is just a quick review, but if you want to better understand how private equity secondaries work, please check out our video titled Private Equity Secondaries. Now, in a private equity secondary transaction, who do you think initiates the transaction? The LP or the GP? As you can probably guess from the topic of this section, the answer is both. You can have an LP-led secondary or a GP-led secondary. LP-led secondaries occur when an existing LP wants to sell its stake in a private equity fund before the end of the fund term. LPs can be motivated to sell because they need liquidity. The LP may want the cash to invest in something else. They may want to restructure their private equity program, just like CalPERS did in 2022, or for portfolio rebalancing. Sometimes LPs need to reduce their private equity exposure because of something called the denominator effect. To learn more about the denominator effect, please check out our video titled Denominator Effect in Private Equity. GP-led secondaries usually refer to secondaries that occur towards the end of the life of a private equity fund, where a GP leads the sale of a company or companies in the fund. Now, why would a GP want to do this? Well, we won't give you the answer yet. We'll talk about motivations for GP-led secondaries a bit later in this video. Before we do, let me clarify that there are multiple structures for a GP to lead a GP-led secondary. A common structure is through a continuation fund, where a private equity firm transfers one or more of their portfolio companies from the existing fund to a new special purpose vehicle. If you want to learn more about LP-led and GP-led secondaries, including the various structures of a GP-led secondary, please check out our video titled LP-led and GP-led Private Equity Secondaries. Now, as promised, let's move on to motivations for GP-led secondaries. I will give you 3 reasons why a GP would want to lead a secondary transaction. Number 1, future growth prospects of portfolio companies. As mentioned earlier, GP-led secondaries usually refer to secondaries that occur toward the end of the life of a private equity fund. A typical private equity fund's life is 10 years in length. Well, towards the end of the fund in years 7, 8, 9, or even 10, there may be a portfolio company or portfolio companies in the private equity fund that the GP believes may have future growth prospects beyond the 10-year term of the private equity fund. Because of this, the GP may not want to sell the company or companies, but some of their investors, the limited partners in the private equity fund, may want to sell the company or companies to get liquidity. Number 2, crystallizing carry. When a GP-led secondary occurs with a continuation fund, the GP is technically selling the company or companies to a continuation fund that the GP itself operates. Because this counts as a sale, the GP is able to earn performance fees, also known as carried interest or the carry, at the time of the sale. Now, in most cases, GP-led secondaries involve a rollover of this carry into the continuation fund so that interests are better aligned. But the GP may still use this sale price as a marker for future fundraising, pay out carry to former personnel, as well as reallocate future carried interest in the continuation fund. Number 3, stapled commitment. You may be familiar with the term stapled financing, where in an acquisition, a financing package is prearranged or stapled to a deal. Well, in a GP-led secondary, this is similar. A stapled commitment in a GP-led secondary is when a new LP, a limited partner, that is not in the existing private equity fund, will agree to invest in both the current GP-led secondary as well as the next private equity fund that the GP will raise. Now, while this is not a main driver for the GP-led secondary, it does help GPs with future fundraising. Just a quick note to mention, I referred to this transaction as a stapled commitment. In industry, many times people will refer to this as a stapled secondary, since it involves the GP-led secondary stapled to the investment in the future private equity fund. And sometimes it is referred to as a stapled primary, since it involves the investment in the future private equity fund, which is stapled to the GP-led secondary. Just to clarify, since the investment in the fund occurs at the beginning of the fund, it is called a primary fund investment. Now let's move on to GP-led secondaries and the EIF. To have success in building a GP-led secondaries portfolio, there are 3 points you need to achieve. And to illustrate each point that I'm going to share, I will use the EIF as an example. Number 1, deal sourcing. To gain access to GP-led secondaries, you need to have relationships with GPs. As for the EIF, it has relationships with more than 1,200 funds in Europe. Number 2, due diligence. To make a decision quickly to invest in a GP-led secondary, you need to know the assets of the GP. Well, as for the EIF, check out this publicly available list of EIF-backed funds. By already having investments in all of these funds, the EIF has visibility into many portfolio companies that may become available through a GP-led secondary transaction in the future. And number 3, diversity. In a GP-led secondaries program, you need to diversify across vintages, strategies, and industries. Well, the EIF is able to accomplish this through their large number of relationships. Now, here's a final thought. GP-led secondaries have been growing quite a lot in the past few years. The structure is complex, and there are potential conflicts of interest that may arise. Investors, here are 3 two-part questions that you may want to ask your GP if you're approached with a GP-led secondary transaction. Number 1, what is the process being used to sell to new LPs, and are there any restrictions on who the new LPs should be? Number 2, are rolling LPs and new LPs getting offered the same economics, including pricing, management fees, and carried interest? And what will happen to existing side letters? And number 3, what is the rationale for the GP-led secondary, and what percentage of crystallized carry is being rolled over, and why. Investors. These transactions are complex, but they may make sense for you. If you decide to invest in a GP-led secondary, please make sure to do your due diligence. In this video, we took a deep dive into GP-led secondaries. We started by giving a review of LP-led and GP-led secondaries, then went over the motivations for GP-led secondaries. Then we talked about GP-led secondaries and the EIF. Do you have any thoughts on GP-led secondaries? If so, please share them in the comments below.